Have you ever wanted to play a game where you get to destroy a city? Like King of Tokyo kind of thing, but without the dice rolling and more of the mindless rampaging. Monstrocity actually gives you that option. You still have your dice rolling there, but it's a little bit less push your luck and more just working together to destroy a city. Who doesn't like that? Let's see how this plays though. Okay, so the first thing we're going to actually have to do is populate our city. So the way you'll do that is by basically populating the various blocks in the game. You'll notice on your map that there are a series of roads, and between each road is a block. So essentially you have to start off with this guy just here. This is the City Hall, and it always has to go on a random space in the very centre block. After that, you have a number of these turrets. Essentially you have to have one on the block with the City Hall, and then from there you randomly distribute one to each block. You will find that possibly one will not have one on there. You just kind of have to leave it. Next up, you have these special buildings, which again you're going to randomly distribute among blocks. Much like with the turrets, you cannot have two on one block. You have to try and get it as even as possible. Then last of all, you have the common buildings. Common buildings are then just spread to everywhere else. You have to make sure that there is at least one on every block. Then you can just randomly distribute which ones are going where elsewhere. Okay, after that, it's on to monster selection. Now this is really cool because one thing I do have to mention about this game is these models are really cool. They actually play a little bit differently from one another as well. They have different amounts of health, they have different amounts of rage, which I'll get to in a second, and they all have a unique ability. I really apologise about the banging outside. I don't know if it's showing up on camera, but what can I do right now? I've actually been trying to record this all day, and I've just not been able to get any quiet at all, so I'm just kind of having to go with it. So apologies. Okay, at this point you enter the first portion of the round, which is simply spawning your monsters. You may notice on the map that you have a little symbol, kind of like a four-way arrow deal, almost like a compass. These are points on the map where you can spawn your monsters. So one by one round the table, you select where you want to start. You all have to start on a different spawn point. You can't have two hero monsters on the same square at any point during this game, though you can actually move through them. The next thing you actually have to do on the round then is start populating your board with little police cars. You've actually got a small board to the side of the main board itself, which acts as a police station. The more police that are populating the map, the more damage they will do later in the game when it's the appropriate time. Now, you will notice that there are certain squares on the board which are all numbered and have a little kind of like police siren pictured on them. That's where you're going to be spawning the police cars. You always start from spot 1, move on to spot 2, and so on and so on. You can't spawn more than one or place a police car on an obstacle on the same space. I probably could have put that a hell of a lot better. So the idea is every single one of these squares can only hold either one police car or one obstacle on them. So if it's already filled up, you move on to the next number, and the next number, and the next number, until everything's filled up. When you actually remove a car off the police station, you'll notice it also reveals a number. So you have to take from the rightmost column and the bottommost police car first. As that number goes up, the more damage they'll be dealing to you over the course of the game. Okay, so after you've completed the police phase, you're then onto the retaliation phase. You actually won't be doing this on your first turn, but just to explain what it is, you'll notice you have the city threat board over here next to the main board as well. So there are 3 boards in total in this game. Essentially, it's going to hold a number of different pieces of information. First of all, depending on which row that your marker is currently on the threat track, you'll notice that you deal a certain amount of damage when turrets fire on you. But also next to it, it won't be at all for the first row, but then when you move to the second one, you'll notice that there's a picture of a card with a ×1 next to it. This simply means that if you're on that row, you draw one of these retaliation cards here at that point. And they have a number of nasty little effects to them. So, for example, sometimes it can mean that you instantly deal extra damage from the police, or it may end up repairing some of the damage that you've already done to buildings. There's a variety of nasty little things that can happen through this that are just going to impede you a little bit. This, though, isn't the only time you'll draw retaliation cards, but again, I'll get to that later. So next up, this is where the fun happens. You are going to rampage with your little critter through the city and try and destroy as much as possible within a 2-minute time limit. Now, there is an app available which you will get a link to when you actually purchase the game, and you can basically use that as your little timer. It just adds a few little sound effects and stuff like that too. Essentially, you are going to frantically roll your 4 dice that you are giving at the beginning of the game, and you are going to resolve each face on the die. So you're going to roll, you're going to look at the dice faces, which all have individual actions to them, and you're going to carry them out over the course of your turn. Once you've done all that, you pick them all up and you frantically roll them again, resolving every single one of the dice before moving on to the next roll. So essentially, you've got to try and pack in as much as you can within a 2-minute time frame. So what do these things do? Okay, so first of all, it should be noted that when you roll your dice, you have one chance to be able to move one space with your character before doing any of your resolving of dice. After this, you absolutely have to trigger your police damage and your building turret damage. So I'll explain a little bit about those. Simply put, for every face that shows a siren on it on your dice, you have to take an amount of damage equal to the current police station level. So remember when I said about the damage they'd be doing? That's how much damage they'll be doing per dice roll of that type. Turrets, however, work a little bit differently. Whereas with police you will always take damage, this one with the turrets very much depends on where you're actually situated on the map. So this is where it gets a little bit complicated. Essentially, every adjacent block to you is going to do damage to you. So what this means is that if you're currently on a block, anything on that block will do damage to you. However, should you be on a road, things get a little trickier. If the road is adjacent to 2 blocks, then you have to take damage from both turrets that are on there. So it kind of multiplies. Should you be at a cross-section where there are 4 blocks adjacent to them, then you're going to be taking damage potentially from 4 different turrets, which is going to do a hell of a lot of damage really, really quickly. So there's a very good chance that you may die before you even get a chance to do anything. Should this happen, you simply just get to spawn at any available spawn point on the map again, and you have to reduce your rage meter down to 0. So after you've done these two, this is actually when rage becomes a thing. You see, you're going to have an ability, and when your rage meter actually reaches the full amount on there, you get to trigger its ability. These can be such things as dealing 2 area damage to everything around you. This means for every adjacent space you're going to do damage to them. Some of the characters may actually have something a bit more targeted, so it may say move forward to, I think there's one that says move in a straight line and deal 4 damage to an adjacent target. So you can deal massive damage to one target and move at the same time. This is kind of cool. Outside of the police and the turret phase, you can actually just deal damage through rage whenever you want. However, you do have to reduce your rage down to 0 again. So after this, you've got a couple of different die faces here. You have this little lightning bolt symbol. What they do is they give you a bit of flexibility. You have a choice of a number of different things. You can either move up to your target's movement value. There are different values for every single character. You may deal 1 damage to an adjacent target. You can heal for 3 damage, or you can raise your rage meter by 1. So, you've got a few things that you can play around with in that instance. Should you roll the rage face on the dice, you just simply move your rage up by 1. And finally, should you get the attack value on the dice, you can deal 1 damage to an adjacent target. So really, you have to just very quickly decide exactly where you're going to force all your damage across the board. There are limits to it, however. Each player has 15 of these damage cubes. For every damage that you deal, it gives you 1 less damage to potentially deal with something else. So really you want to be focusing your attack, although things like police cars only actually have 1 health. So 1 damage and they're off the board, so you really don't even have to use the damage marker for that, as long as you have 1 in your pile at the time. Now the buildings all take various amounts of damage depending on how many players there are, so this can range from something like 8 damage up to something like 12 damage or something like that. Essentially, you've got these handy little player references, so you can hand them around the table depending on how many players you have, and you can kind of all keep track of how much damage is needed on each building. It tends to be your common buildings, your grey ones, take less damage than special buildings. Special buildings usually take a little bit less damage to destroy than turret buildings. So really, in this game, you're going to want to have a game plan as to whether you want to spread out and each individually target individual buildings, or whether you want to gang up on stuff and try and destroy them as quickly as possible. Okay, so after you've had your fun rampage, you then have to enter a cleanup phase. The cleanup phase is first of all going to start by moving your round tracker up 1. You are then going to work out the city threat level. So every single building is worth a certain number of threat points, so the more buildings that you will take out, the further the threat is going to move up on the track. So in other words, when you destroy a building, you simply take a building during the rampage and you place it in front of you, but then at the end of it you start totaling up what the threat actually is. So for example, the common buildings aren't worth quite as much threat as a special building. A special building isn't quite worth as much threat as a turret building. So your threat marker is going to move up. For every retaliation space that you go past, you have to draw one of those retaliation cards that we talked about earlier. However, should you pass a reinforcement, then you get to draw one of these neat little cards that often give you a bonus, whether it be refilling your rage or being able to do a little bit of extra damage, certain things like that. Okay, so after that, you then have to check to see whether you draw an event card. Event cards basically put obstacles on the map that are going to make things hard for you. Often what happens is you will be spawning a number of obstacles across the board in these little police bases that we talked about earlier. Usually it comes with a caveat that kind of restricts you during your rampage over what you can do. For example, there are generators on the map which, when they're on there, they kind of act as a shield for the buildings, so you cannot damage a building until you've gotten rid of the generators first. There are a couple of little neat things like that, just to make things a little bit harder for you. At this point, you check what round you're on. If you are on round 5, then you can't move the tracker up anymore and the game ends there. The game will also end if you've managed to completely level the city. Now, this game works on a star rating system, and you only ever really finish the game unless you score 3 stars. How do you score 3 stars? Well, the first star you gain by destroying City Hall, the second star you get for leveling the entire city, and the third star you actually get for doing it on the 4th, or at least before the 5th round starts. So, one of the things I will say is, if your goal is to get 3 stars, the 5th round is a bit redundant. So, there's just no point in even playing it if you wanted a complete victory in this game. So, I would usually say you would consider it a total loss if you managed no stars. You kind of consider it a mini victory if, say, you got 1 or 2 out of 3 stars. It just seems a little bit weird. So, where does that actually leave this game? Well, truth be told, we did actually have quite a lot of fun with this game, but... Okay, the first thing that we have to mention here is that there is an awful lot of stuff in this game to learn, and because everything's done on a timer, It means you have to do a really, really good job of actually explaining the rules before you actually play the game. I'm not even sure that I've really explained the rules brilliantly whilst we actually do this. But it just means that your chances are, if you haven't done a really, really good job of explaining exactly what all the different die faces do, then you're going to be stopping constantly throughout this game, which is run on a timer, and that's not really ideal. If there wasn't quite so much information there, and if they had maybe, say, a separate reference sheet actually for what all the dice faces mean and stuff like that, then maybe that wouldn't be quite so much of an issue here. Having said that though, there is actually a turn-based mode to this game. So it's probably recommended that you actually use that. So you can't really say that they haven't covered their bases. You should probably be using the turn-based method for the first few games of this before moving on to a proper game of it. So another thing about this game is, despite the fact that there is a lot of information that you need to retain to actually play this game, it's still a bit simple. I mean, the event cards, for example, you draw them on rounds 2, 3 and 4, and there's only 4 different event cards for this game. So you're probably going to see most things in this game through one playthrough of it. It's a little bit of a disappointment on that side of things. I mean, it really feels like you kind of go through the motions in this game. Once you know what everything does, it's a case of just kind of charging in and destroying buildings and doing it the same way each and every single time. So at this point as well, it is actually worth mentioning that there is another variant to this game, which is the Enhanced Edition. Each monster has a unique side to it, which you don't normally use during most games of this. However, should you decide to play the Enhanced game, the buildings take on different properties as well. So you see these different turret buildings, they all do different things, such as a freeze ray that may possibly stop your monster on their turn so they can't actually move. I mean, yeah, it offers a bit more variance to the game, and it does offer more for this game, but you wouldn't play the enhanced version on your first go at this. You really have to have a dedicated group that really enjoy this game and that already know how to play it before introducing these enhanced rules to it. And I'm not sure that this game really has much replayability to it, which really drags it down a little bit, I'm afraid. Okay, as I mentioned earlier as well, these components are actually really nice. This is not a very expensive game, and what you actually get for your money is actually really, really good. You look at some of these figures and they look incredible. Like, you tend to only get figures that look like this in a game when it costs between £60 and £80, but this is very much around the £40 mark. So you are actually getting value for money here. But again, unfortunately, I can't give it a 10 out of 10 for component quality for how much you get. You see these damage markers here? Every single one of them is black. This means that if you decide that what you're going to do is gang up on a building together, you can lose track of how many cubes you've actually assigned to each building, and then during this 2-minute timer, you actually then have to try and organise who takes what damage markers back. It's one of these things that could have been simply solved by having 4 different colours of damage cubes so that you can easily redistribute them back to one another. Maybe you can argue that this is part of the game, but man, there's an awful lot of counting to do in this game, and counting under pressure. If that doesn't sound very appealing to you, then again, this is a mark against this game, because you are forever counting damage markers on buildings, how many damages have been assigned to it, how many damages you have, so you know how to split it when the building eventually goes down. I mean, it's kind of sucks a bit of the fun out of the mindless rampage across the board. And finally, really, there's just one last thing that I want to kind of add. This game is a bunch of admin rounds in between a 2-minute rampage round. I mean, you'll find that people that aren't really involved in the admin side of it, they're going to be quite bored between these 2-minute rounds. It's a lot of organising the police on the board, organising the current round that you're on, organising the threat level, organising where obstacles go on the board, organising where police cars go on the board, and this is all then separated out by a 2-minute rampage. Essentially, that's what you're doing in this game, and while I said we had an awful lot of fun with this game is a fun rampage-style simulation. I don't think I could recommend it as a game, though, because as a game it just doesn't feel like there's very much substance to it. I mean, some of this could be tempered by the fact that you could argue, well, what's the age range for this thing? Everything's very brightly coloured, all the monsters look wonderfully cartoonish. This surely must be aimed at children. Well, I don't think children are going to be able to retain enough of this information to really be able to get full enjoyment out of this game. One of the things is that everyone round the table is kind of trusted to know the rules and be able to carry them out on their turn. And I'm not sure kids can necessarily be trusted with this thing. I know every kid is different, but I think in general you would say that there's an awful lot to remember here, and kids do tend to bend the rules and stuff. I mean, it just seems like a bit of a fault here. But like I said, we still had a lot of fun with it, and at the end of the day, even if you are bending the rules, if you are a kid playing this and you just want to play it your way, then who could you really be to criticise that? I mean, as long as you have this game and you're having fun with it, you know, how can you really argue with it? So as a simulation, I would give this a big thumbs up. But as a game, I can't. And really, that's the bottom line. If you have enjoyed this video, then please do remember to give it a thumbs up. Maybe leave us a comment in the comments down below. And subscribe if you haven't already. If you would like to follow us on social medias, you can do on Twitter at EverybodyDice and on Instagram at EverybodyDiceShow. We also have a Facebook page you can find at facebook.com/EverybodyDice. If you would like to do more for us, we do have a Patreon page you can find at patreon.com/EverybodyDice, where for as little as $1 a month, you can actually help us decide what games we're going to review, like this one right here that was voted on by our wonderful patrons. And finally, if you want to watch more of our stuff, we probably have some videos somewhere on this screen here. Please do give them a click and watch through if you can. Thank you very much for joining us on this review. Till next time, see you later!